Firstly, thank you, Danielle. Thank you to Cirad for inviting me. I'm very pleased to accept the invitation. I think it's really important to work together, to share experience and to learn from each other. My presentation takes quite a different tack to the one you've just heard, because it's going to be more focused on specific examples and perhaps not the what and the why, but the how of doing impact assessment and how we're working on it in this project. So I have really three things I want to talk about, and I hope I can do them in 20 minutes. I want to say some very brief words about the Impresa project itself, where it comes from, what it's doing, and where it will end up. Then I want to narrow the focus very specifically to one part of Impresa, and although I'm the coordinator of Impresa, I am just first amongst equals in terms of my colleagues, and so I am involved in and very actively engaged on a case study in the UK, and it's on the Dairy Cow Fertility Index. And then if I have time, and I have one final slide, but I want to comment on what we're trying to do in Impresa is to combine qualitative and quantitative methods. And there's a sense, I think already, that there's a kind of paradigm war that's been going on between people who believe in quantitative assessment as being the proper way of doing things, and actually all you need to do is measure something and you will have understood it. Whereas a more nuanced approach would try to understand the complexity of impact pathways and to try to refine investigative approaches. So that's my plan. When you're writing research proposals, you should be very careful what you say the aim of something is, because that aim will come back to haunt you. And this is the aim that I wrote for the Impresa project 2.5 years ago. Actually, I'm not too unhappy with it. I think that the really important words on this slide are measure, assess, and comprehend. Okay, so there are kind of the three elements of understanding impact. Firstly, you need to know what it is, you need to know why it happens, and what the importance of the different dimensions of impact are. The aim also recognizes the kind of fuzziness that agricultural science is blurring at the boundaries. It's not just concerned solely with agriculture, but with obviously post-harvest questions. It's also, the science itself is changing, a very strong interest today in genomics and phenomics. The way in which people's disciplinary focuses as individual scientists add up to the efforts that contribute to outcomes and impact is changing quite fast, perhaps faster than we realize, and we'll wake up to a different world one day. Excuse me. The approach of Impresa has been broadly to look at three things. Firstly, an overall perspective on what we know about research effort. And surprisingly, in Europe, we know very little because the remit of the CGIAR program on monitoring and evaluating research only is focused on low-income countries. Actually, there isn't a comparable set of measurements for Europe. The second part of the approach is bilateral. On the one hand, looking through econometric kind of studies and social accounting analysis, trying to look top-down at impact, and then actually a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods in case studies, trying to look from the bottom up, from tracking individual innovations from their origins to their impacts over the whole cycle. And of course, one of the concerns, and actually I should say a little bit about the background, one of the concerns is that in Europe, as in global terms, we don't concentrate enough on impact and understanding the impact, and we don't engage enough as scientists with the broader communities of interest. And so if we were going to have a project on that, we'd look pretty stupid if we didn't concentrate very strongly on stakeholder engagement. So that's a strong part of the project. I hope you can, maybe you can't see this, but it's also from the proposal, it's the workflow diagram. It shows the interrelationship between the different work packages. What I'm going to concentrate on is this part here, the case studies of science-based innovation in agriculture and food systems. Just to note that this part here plays a role when we get to the third point that I'm going to discuss. And there's a lot of interaction. We had, for example, an email conference right at the start of the project, which helped us to focus. And there's a lot of advisory input, particularly Danielle, for example, is a member of our scientific advisory committee. The bottom strand makes it look as though project coordination and management, which I'm responsible for, is somehow outside of the process. Actually, that's just an artifact of two-dimensional representation. The management is of everything, it's involved in everything. So, just to say a few words about the case study approach. So it's one of two strands. The selection of case studies, I think, particularly with regarding to number, I think is really important. So in the Cirad Impress project, there's a large number of case studies in order to sort of comprehend the broad range of activities that the centre is engaged upon. My strategy, and I should acknowledge also the input of Danielle and Sylvain, who are in the audience, who are directly responsible for this work package, but my strategy has been to choose relatively few and sharply contrasting case studies, because I think it is through the comparison between the application of research through impact pathways to impact itself in contrasting situations, so the same phenomenon in different contexts, is the best way of drawing out the issues that affect the way that impact is generated. So we have 6, and they represent differences in scale. So some are very regionalized, others are very broad scale. There's a mixture of animal agriculture, of arable and permanent crops, and different technologies. So breeding and performance recording is the one in my case, but there's also remote sensing and robotics and so on are involved as well. So from the selection, we move to developing a methodological framework, which is very much what you've heard about already, is about a theory of change, identifying pathways of impact, and then looking at how they work. We've taken a sequential approach so that the possibility of comparison between cases is opened up without having too much direction. This has been we're on a knife edge, really, in the sense that we don't want case studies to go off in different directions, because then it would make the process of comparison difficult. But at the same time, we want to be flexible enough that the cases can respond, the examination can respond to the particular context in which it's being applied. So we've got this 5-step approach within individual case studies, and then the comparative analysis comes at the end. So I'll just talk you through, firstly, a rather naive representation of what we're looking at in terms of case study analysis, and then the steps involved in the case study that I'm working on in the United Kingdom, which is about adoption of a dairy cow fertility index and influencing farmers' choices of what crosses they want to make between characteristics that they aim to produce in dairy cows to produce milk. All right. So that sort of blue sky thinking, represented actually as a cloud in the blue sky, but the blue sky thinking is the source, what we start off as thinking as influencing what happens at farm level. Of course, there may be a pathway which we can identify, which, and there's fairly well-trodden traditional pathway from science to dissemination, extension, and uptake and effect. But there may be other pathways. There may be something that we don't know anything about, and it's only through a detailed examination of particular cases that we would find out what alternative pathways there might be. And of course, there might be things completely unconnected with research which influence the change, which we want to unravel from the process. Right, so a case study is a story, it's a narrative. And in the narrative that I'm going to describe, these are the major characters. Right? At this level, looking at a specific innovation over the course of about 10 or 15 years, there are real people involved, and these real people are, they're still around, and so we can talk to them and we can find out what roles they play. So let me just introduce, first of all, Melissa. Melissa is the origin of this entire process. She was a PhD student in animal science. Actually, her topic of her PhD was something completely different, but she got attracted to the subject of fertility. And one of the main outcomes of her work was to demonstrate that there was a decline in fertility of around about 1% a year. So if you have a sort of success rate on first service of about 20% or something like that, then decline 15 years ago would mean that now we'd be having, if nothing was done to change breeding policies, we'd have very much reduced fertility in dairy cows. And that, of course, costs farmers a lot of money. Mike Coffey is Mr. Big. He's the man who pulls all the strings behind the scenes. He's a very important researcher in dairy livestock science, is very well connected, has a lot of experience, and is somebody who is a kind of controlling presence behind the whole story. His sort of alter ego is David Garwis, who is an unconventional civil servant, somebody not a career civil servant, but came from, after being dissatisfied with a career in the private sector, came into work in government to try and achieve some change. He became equally dissatisfied with working in government subsequently. Marco Winters was working at the time of in the early span of the case story, was working in an artificial insemination company, producing semen straws for use by farmers, but has subsequently become the person in charge of breeding policy in the levy-funded research body for the dairy industry in the United Kingdom. And then Andy Warren is the manager of the National Milk Record Service, which collects information from farms on every possible aspect of dairy production, from somatic cell counts through to times of service and lactation length and production data, all that kind of stuff. So really this is about big data more than anything else. Okay, so the pathway which we got, and was interesting as we spoke to each individual in that list of characters and others as well, at each stage what we understood the pathway to be slightly changed, so our perspective was evolving throughout all of this. Okay, so what we came up with at the point of mapping the impact pathway at the beginning was that there was Melissa's work. Her PhD had enormous importance. That generated something called, it generated a research project, but interestingly, David Garwis, the DEFRA official, was insistent that this project should bring together, it should be a process of collaboration, not competition, between the major sectors of livestock science. So he said to all of the scientists from all of the different centres investigating this in Britain, you must join this project. If you don't bother, I want a collaborative effort, and it's got to be in conjunction with the main commercial players. So milk processors, the AI companies, and advisory services. So it was discovered through the process of initiating this performance recording research that there were certain bulls that had very poor records in terms of propagating fertility. And interestingly, what happened as a result of this was that the companies that were involved in this process quietly took those bulls off their catalogues. So they were no longer available for farmers to use. Right? So this is important because it's not the traditional pathway that we recognize. Because of the involvement of the commercial sector, they were able to, as insiders, use this information to change their policies and change their commercial activities. Now, that didn't have too much of an influence at first, but after about 2 years after this fertility index was first published, Interbull, which is the organization to compare about 80% of the semen used in the UK was imported, but an international standard was established. And so that meant that all bulls could be compared on the same performance criterion. And the result that came from mapping the impact pathway in this way was that there was a reduced calving interval. So there's a diagram which shows calving intervals increasing and then decreasing overall and on aggregate. Right, so our perspective changed from talking to different individual key informants, but then our perspective changed again from talking to the end users. Okay, so this is a snapshot of a focus group discussion that was held in Northern Ireland a fortnight ago. And this is one of the diagrams that comes from the flip chart in that particular meeting. So the focus groups included farmers, but they also included advisors, vets, farm managers, because dairying in certain parts of the United Kingdom is very intensive, a mega dairy principle of 2,000 or more cows and in-house vet, that kind of thing. Also, in some of the discussions, people from the National Milk Record Service who actually provided the data. So they gave us a completely, these are the ground level stakeholders, gave us a completely different perspective. And what we were able to determine was the principal channels by which the information reached farmers themselves, not very interested in a fertility index. The role of vets and also of the semen companies is crucially important because they provide services to farmers. They have a reputation to defend, so they will provide advice which is tailored to enhancing farm businesses. And vets have changed their character quite a lot, especially the new generation. So they will be talking in terms which I, as a business economist, would be completely comfortable with in terms of farm performance and the importance of seasonality in milk production, all those kinds of things. So we are still at the stage where we're trying to isolate what the interplay between the key informants and their overview of the process and the stakeholders and their view from underneath, what that actually means. But I think we have some interim conclusions. One of the conclusions which is not on the slide, which I think is very striking, is that the cycle of impact is actually longer than the lifetime career of a scientist. So very often a scientist will not see the full impact of their work, and they will be working in a context where the impact of what people have been done previously. So actually it's quite difficult to understand impact pathways because an awful lot of the people involved are often retired, and often so well retired that they really don't want to talk to us because they've got better things to do with their time. I think what is just emerging, and because we've only just completed the most recent of the focus group, is actually farm advisors, although they were not important and they had to cope with a change of commercial policy by the artificial insemination companies, their input is actually more important than we realized earlier on. It's not just a matter of short-circuiting the process by involving the commercial interests in the research process. And that actually the way that farmers make decisions, or the way that farmers perceive that they make decisions, which may not necessarily be the same thing, is still quite strongly influenced by traditional extension workers. And then we have yet to put together our thoughts to convey back to the initial key informants what we think the pathway is and get their reactions to it. So actually, doing a case study like this is quite exciting. It's a bit different to what, it's not the usual business of economists to pore over computers and to run econometric programs and to make profound judgments on very little evidence at all. It's actually talking to people, and it's like a detective's role in terms of uncovering and interpreting the evidence. Now, I wonder whether this is, there's a joke, all right, maybe it's not in very good taste. But Lyndon Johnson, who was President of the United States in the 1960s, used to say that something like this is like pissing down your leg. It feels pretty hot to you, but it doesn't impress anyone else very much. Well, I think that we can divide our comments on methodology really into two parts. One is the pissing down your leg kind of thing, which is that there have been for a long time paradigm wars. There have been people who are strong proponents of qualitative methods because they give you really deep insights, they give you a rich picture of the complexity of the situation, and you can understand what's going on, and you can use that understanding to refine your impact. And I think that is appropriate from the point of view of the research community. But actually, the kind of the hard evidence that policymakers want has got to be something that can be boiled down to half a page of a sheet of A4 and some numbers which are persuasive. Right? In terms of our work, I think the interplay between qualitative and quantitative can be viewed in a number of ways. The traditional way is that qualitative work can provide a better basis for better quantitative measurement. Okay, so you refine. So, for example, something like this work could lead to structural equation modeling, which is a simultaneous equation system that involves things like latent variables and so on. Right? So you can refine your quantitative approach by doing qualitative work beforehand. Okay. Another justification for combining the two methods may be that, on the one hand, you have two different approaches that lead you to the same result, so actually you must be right. And if you have 3 and 4 and 5, then even better. I'm not sure that either of those are really the main justification for using a mixed method approach. I think that the important thing really is that the world is too complex for any particular paradigm to completely comprehend it. Right? And so you need to, and to do that, actually you have to have considerable breadth of vision. You have to struggle to escape your own disciplinary background. And that, for many of us, is a hard thing to do. And so, I think to conclude, I've already, actually, I often do this. I've said my conclusions before I actually get to the point in the slide where they're written out for all to see. But to conclude, I think that it's important to recognize that impact evaluation has many roles, and the style and the presentation has to be tailored to the specific purpose for which you're using it. And the main goal, I think, is that we need to improve impact. We can always do a little bit more. And so if we use evaluation approaches like this, then we have a better chance, at least, of making more impact. And so that's really, I think, the point of the whole exercise. Anyway, merci de votre attention.